Hi everyone, and welcome back to our channel. If you love emotional, dramatic, and meaningful stories that touch your heart and make you think, you're in the right place. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our powerful new uploads. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready to dive into a story that will stay with you long after it ends. The September wind rustled through the fiery red maple trees surrounding the Miller estate, sweeping dried leaves across the stone-paved path. Grace Miller stood silently in front of the ornate wrought iron gate, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the soft kicks of her unborn child. She took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. This was where her husband, Ethan Miller, had grown up, and now it would be her home for the next 3 months while he was away on a business trip to Germany. An SUV pulled up to the gate. Ethan stepped out and quickly opened the door for her. He adjusted her scarf gently, his touch full of care and affection. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" Ethan asked in a low, concerned voice. "I'll be fine." Grace smiled, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "Your mom seems nice. I think we'll get along." Ethan looked into her eyes, hesitating slightly before saying softly, "Mom is traditional, a bit strict, but she means well. I've told her clearly that you need rest and proper care." Grace nodded. She knew Ethan loved her and always put her first. If he believed his mother would take good care of her, then she wanted to believe it too. The large front door opened, and Helen Miller, a woman in her 60s with a dignified look, her silver hair neatly pinned up, stepped out to greet them. She wore a charcoal gray dress, a wool coat with a fur collar, and black leather gloves. Her smile was polite, but lacked warmth. "Welcome, Grace. You look, well," Helen said in an even tone, not exactly distant but far from warm. "Thank you, Mom," Grace replied politely. Helen led them inside. The interior of the mansion was a blend of classical and modern elements: oil paintings, a grandfather clock, and velvet armchairs. Grace felt as though she had stepped into another world, a solemn, perfectly organized world full of unspoken rules. After a light dinner, chicken soup and toasted bread prepared by the housekeeper, Helen showed Grace to her room on the second floor. It overlooked the back garden, with large windows and a sturdy oak bed covered in crisp white linen. "This used to be Ethan's father's reading room," Helen noted. "Now it's the best room for rest. No direct sunlight in the morning." Grace smiled and thanked her. She felt a bit of sincerity in that remark. That night, the couple lay side by side. Ethan held her tightly and whispered, "I'll call every night. If anything happens, just tell me, okay?" Grace nodded, comforted by his warm embrace. The next morning, Ethan left early for the airport. Before getting into the car, he kissed her goodbye and reminded her once more, "Eat well, get plenty of rest, and don't stress about anything. I love you." Grace waved as the car disappeared down the tree-lined driveway. She turned back and walked into the house. Helen stood at the bottom of the stairs, her expression entirely different from the night before. There was no smile, no cheerful good morning. She looked at Grace for a long moment before saying coldly, "Now it really begins." Grace froze. She didn't quite understand what Helen meant, but before she could respond, Helen had already turned away and disappeared into the living room. That morning, there was no sign of any housekeepers. Grace went to the kitchen to make some tea and saw a note stuck to the fridge. "Starting today, we will no longer employ housekeepers. We must reduce unnecessary expenses. Your cooperation is appreciated. Helen Miller." Grace was stunned. She looked around the kitchen. The sink was full of dirty dishes, crumbs littered the floor, and the fridge was a disorganized mess. Was she, 6 months pregnant, supposed to handle all of this alone? At noon, Helen summoned Grace to the living room and handed her a piece of paper listing the weekly chores: clean the living room, mop the stairs, hang the laundry, tend the backyard garden. Grace scanned the list and swallowed hard. She gently spoke, "Mom, I'm 6 months pregnant. The doctor advised me to avoid strenuous activities." Helen didn't look at her. Instead, she said curtly, "Women in the Miller family don't expect to be pampered. If you want to be part of this family, you must learn to carry your own weight." Grace clenched the paper in her hand, something inside her cracking. But she said nothing. Instead, she returned to her room, placed her hand over her belly, and whispered, "We'll be okay. I promise." The afternoon sun faded, and a chill breeze from the pine forest behind the estate drifted through the window frame. In that vast mansion, only the ticking of the grandfather clock and the weary footsteps of a young woman echoing down the hallway remained, the beginning of a life she had never imagined. In contrast to the peaceful scenery outside, the rows of crimson maple trees and the soft golden sunlight, the Miller mansion now felt cold and oppressive to Grace, like a fortress stripped of emotion. Since Ethan had left, everything had changed. No more light meals, no more housekeeper sounds, and most of all, no more polite smiles from her mother-in-law, Helen Miller. On the third morning, Grace woke up feeling heavy and sluggish. From the hallway, she could already smell the scent of something burnt. She walked into the kitchen and found a pot of congee dried up and scorched at the bottom. On the table sat a slice of dry toast and a bottle of water. No coffee, no milk, no fruit like before. Grace quietly sat down, forcing herself to eat the dry toast while trying to ignore the protests from her stomach. But the piercing gaze from Helen, standing at the staircase, made her swallow uneasily. "You're still sitting there?" Helen's sharp voice rang out. "I thought a grown woman would know how to start her day by being useful." Grace put the toast down and swallowed hard. "I was planning to clean the rooms after breakfast." "Good. Then clean the kitchen, sweep the hallway, wipe the stairs, and check the backyard. Those weeds are out of control." Grace wanted to speak. She wanted to remind her that she was pregnant, that the doctor had advised her to rest, that she couldn't bend over for too long. But Helen's eyes silenced her. This wasn't a conversation, it was a command. That afternoon, after nearly 2 hours of mopping floors and scrubbing the toilet, Grace slumped to the ground. Her back ached, her legs were swollen, and her head throbbed from the smell of cleaning chemicals. She reached for her phone and began dialing Ethan. But then she hesitated. Wasn't he in meetings in Frankfurt? Hadn't he told her, "Please don't make me worry. I need to stay focused for these 3 months"? She didn't want him to come back because of her. She didn't want to be the overly sensitive wife in the eyes of her mother-in-law. Grace turned off the screen and sighed before slowly getting back to her feet to continue cleaning, like a ghost drifting through her husband's house. That evening, Grace tried to cook a simple dinner, pumpkin soup and chicken with rice. She placed the bowl in front of Helen and gently invited her. "Would you like to try what I cooked, Mom?" Helen scooped up a small spoonful, chewed slowly, then set the spoon down with a cold voice. "Tasteless. Do you even know how to use spices?" Ethan never liked bland food. Grace lowered her head. Ethan had once told her his mother was particular, but she hadn't expected every word and gesture to be so critical. After dinner, while Grace was clearing the table, Helen walked over and handed her a stack of papers, a weekly chore schedule. "I wrote this down so you don't have to think. Everyone in this house contributes." Grace glanced through the schedule. Monday, laundry, hang dry, fold, iron. Tuesday, clean all first-floor windows. Wednesday, weed the backyard, mow the lawn. Thursday, scrub the garage. Friday, clean the attic. Weekend, cook meals for the week, bake bread, make preserves. She could hardly believe her eyes. "Mom, these tasks, can I really manage them all on my own?" Helen shrugged. "When I was pregnant, I worked in the garden and cleaned horse stables. You're only 6 months along and already complaining while eating and sleeping like royalty." "I'm just worried about the baby." The doctor said, "Doctors always tell you to rest. It's how they make money." I gave birth to Ethan in the dead of winter and was back baking for the shop the next day. Grace was speechless. She realized she would never win an argument with Helen. No logic would ever reach her if it didn't align with her own standards. Night fell. Grace sat by the window, writing in a small journal she kept hidden under her pillow. Her handwriting trembled. "This is not a home. It is a test of patience. But I have to be strong. For my child. For Ethan." The light in her room went out. But within Grace, the invisible walls of the Miller mansion continued to rise, day after day, hour after hour. A week had passed since Ethan left the United States. For Grace, time was no longer measured in days or nights, but by the number of times she scrubbed the floors, the times she washed overflowing dishes, and the times her back ached from bending over to clean or carry water from the ground floor to the third. Her journal had grown thicker with pages, each one soaked with unspoken frustration. That morning, like usual, Grace woke up before 8. She went to the kitchen, made a pot of weak tea, and cut a few slices of dry bread. No milk, no butter, not a word from anyone. While tidying up the kitchen, she noticed a note taped to the fridge. Helen's neat, slanted handwriting, written in black ink. The weeds in the backyard are too tall. Cut them all today. Ush. Grace sighed. The night before, she hadn't been able to sleep because of leg cramps and the baby kicking constantly. This morning, her legs were still swollen, and her hands ached from scrubbing the downstairs bathroom yesterday until they were red and raw. But she had no choice. She took the gardening shears from the shed and crouched down to trim the tall grass along the fence. The October sun was soft but still harsh, baking her neck and soaking her shirt with sweat. By 11 a.m., Grace felt dizzy. Her heart pounded, and a wave of nausea made her grip the brick wall beside the house to steady herself. She knew she needed to rest, but the housework was still waiting. She went back into the kitchen and checked the fridge. There was nothing but a few wrinkled apples and a bottle of water. She decided to make chicken soup, something simple and nutritious. She filled a pot with water and started chopping chicken. But as she lifted the pot to place it on the stove, a droplet of water from the faucet landed on her shoe. Her foot slipped. Everything happened in an instant. Grace lost her balance. She slipped, falling backward, the pot of hot water splashing, her lower back slamming against the counter, and her belly bumping into the cabinet. A sharp pain shot up her side. Panicked, she placed her trembling hand on her belly. Nothing seemed immediately wrong, but then the dull ache turned sharp. She felt nauseated, her vision blurred. She crawled toward the hallway, struggling to stay conscious. "Ms. Helen, help me," she croaked. Footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Helen appeared, standing at the landing, looking down. Another act? Trying to get out of chores again by pretending to fall. Grace couldn't reply. She curled up, clutching her belly, her face pale. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Helen didn't come closer. She stared for a moment, then turned and went back to her room, closing the door behind her. Luckily, less than 10 minutes later, the front gate creaked open. A familiar voice called out, "Grace, are you home?" It was Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had visited earlier with homemade cookies. She was carrying a basket of baked goods and freshly picked pears. When she heard the faint groan from the hallway, she rushed in. Seeing Grace collapsed, she panicked and called 911. "Please, she's pregnant. She's in terrible pain. Hurry." Grace was taken to the local hospital in just 15 minutes. On the way, she was half conscious, hearing the paramedics speaking over the radio. "We suspect early labor due to trauma. She needs immediate evaluation." When she awoke in a white hospital room, a stern-looking female doctor stood at her bedside. "Ms. Grace, you're very lucky. If you had arrived 20 minutes later, the situation could have been much worse. The baby is stable, but you must rest completely from now on. No heavy lifting, no stress." Grace couldn't speak. She stared up at the ceiling, tears silently falling down her cheeks. Not from physical pain, but from the pain of being abandoned by someone who should have loved her like a mother. That evening, Mrs. Carter came to visit. She sat beside the hospital bed and held Grace's hand. "Sweetheart, I called Ethan. He's flying back from Frankfurt. Don't worry, you're not alone." Grace opened her mouth weakly, squeezing Mrs. Carter's hand. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I don't know. Sure. Don't think about it now. Just rest. Let Ethan take care of the rest." She gently stroked Grace's hair like a real mother. And for the first time in many days, Grace felt at peace. Back at the Miller mansion, Helen sat in the reading room. The yellow desk lamp cast a dull light. She flipped through the pages of the newspaper as if nothing had happened. She didn't call. She didn't ask. She didn't visit the hospital. Because in her mind, everything was still going according to plan. What she didn't know was that her plan was about to face a storm. The sound of jet engines roared through the night sky as Ethan Miller's plane landed at Dulles International Airport. His hands clenched tightly around the handle of his carry-on bag, knuckles white, jaw set with grim determination. He had received Mrs. Carter's call mid-meeting, and the calm voice of his elderly neighbor had shaken him to the core. "Ethan, your wife is in the hospital. She fell. The baby was nearly lost. You need to come home." He didn't ask for details. He didn't care about work or contracts. The only thing that mattered now was Grace and the child she carried. 2 hours later, Ethan stood in the hospital room where Grace lay resting. She looked pale, fragile, but her belly still rose and fell with every breath. The monitor beside her beeped steadily. He sat down beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, her eyes welled up with tears. "Ethan," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." She tried to sit up, but he gently urged her to stay still. There were so many things he wanted to ask. What had happened? How bad was the fall? Why hadn't she called him sooner? But he didn't press. Instead, he held her hand and waited. It wasn't long before the attending doctor entered, followed by Mrs. Carter. "She's stable," the doctor reassured, "but she's suffered a lot of stress. She'll need complete bed rest for the rest of the pregnancy. No physical work, no mental pressure." And frankly, the doctor hesitated. "I'm surprised she was still doing household chores at all." Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her gaze firm. "Ethan," she said gently, "you need to hear everything." The story came out like a dam breaking. Mrs. Carter recounted what she had seen. Grace on the floor, Helen's coldness, the chores, the starvation, the constant emotional pressure. She didn't dramatize it, didn't exaggerate. Her voice was steady, but the facts hit Ethan like stones. He stood in silence, every word carving a deeper crack in his heart. When the story was done, he kissed Grace's hand, promised to return soon, and left the hospital. Not out of anger, out of resolve. The familiar iron gate creaked open as Ethan entered the Miller estate that night. The garden still looked meticulously trimmed. He now knew it had been Grace's doing, not some gardener. The porch light glowed softly above the grand oak door, and the cold silence of the house wrapped around him like a shroud. Helen was in the reading room, sipping tea and flipping through a novel. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Ethan," she blinked. "Why aren't you in Germany?" He dropped his bag to the floor with a dull thud and stared at her, his voice low and steady. "Grace is in the hospital." Helen's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "She fell. Because she was scrubbing the kitchen floor. After you made her cut weeds, clean windows, cook meals, and do all the chores you used to have staff for. She's 6 months pregnant, Mom." Helen set her teacup down calmly. She needed to learn. She's going to be a mother. I was trying to make her stronger. Ethan's voice rose, shaking with fury. By starving her? By denying her milk and fruit? By locking away the food she needed? By turning your back when she begged for help? What kind of strength is that, Mom? Helen folded her arms. "You're overreacting. Women these days are too fragile. When I was pregnant with you, I managed a bakery, cleaned the house, and still delivered cakes at 6 months." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "This is in the 1980s, and Grace is not you. She was doing all of it alone while you watched, and you nearly cost us our baby." A long silence fell between them. For a moment, Helen's expression faltered. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken. Was it doubt? Regret? But she quickly masked it. "I didn't mean for that to happen," she said quietly. "I didn't know it would go that far." Ethan stepped closer. "You didn't care enough to find out. That's worse." Another silence. Then he added more gently, "I love this house. I respected you. I thought I was lucky to be raised by a strong mother. But now, I see strength without empathy is just cruelty in a nice dress." He turned to leave. Helen called after him. "So what now? You're going to abandon your family for that girl?" He looked over his shoulder. "She is my family." By noon the next day, Grace was discharged from the hospital under the condition she would be on strict bed rest. Ethan had already arranged everything. They wouldn't return to the mansion. Instead, he took her to a quiet seaside town in North Carolina, to a charming one-story cottage he had found online while sitting in the hospital room. It had no grand hallways, no chandeliers, no garden mazes, just sunshine, sea breeze, and peace. Ethan carried Grace inside, settled her on the sofa, and kissed her forehead. "This is our home now," he whispered. Grace looked around, tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from gratitude. For the first time in weeks, she could finally breathe. 12 months passed. Seasons came and went, and so did the echoes of pain that once haunted Grace Miller's memories. The small coastal town in North Carolina had become home. Their cottage, with its white shutters and blooming lavender bushes, wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, filled with laughter, music, and the scent of fresh-baked bread. It was everything the Miller estate wasn't. Grace had given birth to a healthy baby girl on a calm June morning. The moment she held her daughter, she cried, not from fear or exhaustion, but because she finally felt whole. Ethan, sitting beside her, asked gently, "Have you decided on a name?" Grace smiled through her tears and nodded. "Lily. Lily Helen Miller." Ethan blinked. "Helen." She turned to him, her gaze soft but steady. "Yes," she said, "not for the woman your mother was, but for the woman she could have been. I want our daughter to carry the strength of that name, but also rewrite what it means." Ethan said nothing for a moment, then simply reached out and held both his wife and daughter close. Back in Virginia, the Miller mansion stood still and silent. The vines on the outer walls were overgrown. The garden, once pruned to perfection, now sprouted wildflowers between untamed grass. The marble floors remained spotless, but the air inside was stagnant, the silence heavy. Helen Miller had not heard from Ethan in months. Not after the night he walked out. He had called once when Lily was born. He had spoken clearly, respectfully, but firmly. "We named her Lily Helen. Grace chose it. If you'd like to meet her one day, our door is open. But things will be on our terms now." Helen hadn't replied, not out of anger, but uncertainty. She didn't know how to respond to an invitation that carried both olive branch and boundary. At first, she told herself it was all beneath her, that she had done what any strong woman would do. That Grace was too soft, too modern, too dependent. But as the days passed, she found herself sitting alone more often. Meals became simpler, quieter. The chair across from her at the dining table remained empty. She didn't speak of regret, but she no longer denied it to herself. One chilly autumn morning, a courier arrived at the Miller estate. Helen signed for the small parcel, expecting another catalog or bill. But when she opened the box, she froze. Inside was a framed photo. It showed a little girl, no more than 8 months old, crawling on a picnic blanket, smiling at the camera. Behind her, Grace sat barefoot on the grass, holding Lily's hand, while Ethan crouched beside them holding a cupcake with a single candle. Taped to the back was a handwritten note. "She took her first steps last week. She called me Mama, and then said Helen. She's learning names. We thought you might want to know. Grace." Helen stared at the photo for a long time. Then, with hands that trembled more than they used to, she placed it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, right beside Ethan's childhood picture. For the first time in over a year, her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, from longing. Several weeks later, Helen found herself at the bus station in downtown Richmond. Not the kind of place she frequented, but she didn't trust herself to drive 6 hours alone anymore. She clutched the letter Grace had sent the week before, a formal, polite invitation to Lily's first birthday party. The address was handwritten, the envelope lined with pale yellow paper. The kind of detail someone only includes when they want you to feel welcome, even if they don't say it outright. Helen stepped onto the bus. She didn't know what she would say when she arrived. She didn't even know if they would open the door. But she had to try, because love unspoken is love wasted. And because sometimes names are more than memories, they're second chances.